All right, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who may be newer to CISCRP, we are a Boston-based but globally focused nonprofit. Our mission is to educate and empower patients and the public to make informed decisions about clinical research and to ensure that participants know how important their role is in public health in general. As a nonprofit, not only are we an independent third party, but any revenue we generate is invested right back into our education and outreach efforts, as well as our manpower to continue all of the innovation and flexibility that we offer in our service lines. In terms of those service lines, we do work on a wide range of clinical trial documents. We produce informed consent documents, all the way through unblinded communications and trial result summaries, all of which have been translated into plain language, and all of which are developed with input from patients and patient advocates, as well as public or members of the public, caregivers, and medical professionals. We also have an entire team dedicated to more customized and general educational deliverables as well. And that team creates everything from brochures to videos to customized health literacy workshops. So there's a lot going on in that custom team. But getting back to what we're talking about today, we're very excited to be discussing the EU regulation 536/2014. And our discussion is going to focus not only on plain language summaries, but also the Annex 1 part of the regulation that's been drawing a lot of attention recently. Annex 1 of the regulation requests a 2-page plain language protocol synopsis be uploaded to CTIS during the initial trial application stage. And then a separate regulation in the UK is also requiring a similar protocol synopsis document. So the current debate around both of these items seems to be whether A, the documents are required, B, the exact purpose of the document, and then C, whether or not they need to be translated into plain language before they're uploaded. So I'd like to set the stage for our discussion today by mentioning that the protocol synopsis came up several times during the Good Lay Summary Practice workshops earlier this year. And the consensus was that providing these documents in plain language was highly beneficial for a few reasons. First, it allows the document to appeal to a wider audience. Second, a plain language version of a protocol synopsis can help pre-select some wording choices for your plain language summary. On our panel discussion today, we have Chris Fitzer from UCB, and then Kim Edwards from CISCRP. And I'm going to ask them each to do some introductions. Chris, we'd like to start with you.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. My name is Christopher Fitzer, and I'm the Transparency Operations Lead at UCB Biosciences. Since I joined UCB in 2017, I've worked on a variety of transparency activities, including developing a comprehensive global transparency policy, overseeing the operations and processes related to anonymization activities, preparing data and documents for data sharing and disclosure, and the topic we're talking about today, developing plain language summaries of clinical results, and now the protocol synopses in plain language. Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, Chris. And then Kim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So my name is Kim Edwards. I'm the Associate Director of Medical Writing at CISCRP. So I've been able to sort of get both into the weeds of writing plain language summaries and protocol synopses, and also sort of think about the bigger picture considerations of what we want these to look like overall, and how to execute them from a process point of view. So looking forward to discussing both of these deliverables with you and Chris today. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kim. And then for myself, I'm the Associate Director of Health Communications here at CISCRP. I'll be guiding us through the discussion and moderating all of the slides as we move through. So if we could back up to the agenda slide really quickly. For the agenda today, we've already done our welcome and our introductions. Next, we'll be moving into an overview of the European Union Clinical Trials Regulation, EU CTR 536/2014. specifically talking about the protocol synopsis and the plain language summary, as I mentioned. Then we'll move into our panel discussion and we'll leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. Now, before we dive into the presentation, I'd like to just get a few housekeeping items out of the way. If you have any questions or comments during this discussion, please put them in the Q&A box specifically. This is the box that we are monitoring for the questions so that we will be able to actually answer your questions. And then this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be shared as part of the follow-up communications tomorrow. So if we can proceed on to the first slide of the presentation. I will pass the discussion to Kim to get us started.
Thanks, Julie. I didn't know if we had some polling questions first that we wanted to do. Otherwise, I will launch right into it. There we go. So folks could take a second and just respond to our first question there. Now that the EU 536/2014 has gone into effect, is your company writing plain language summaries? Yes for all studies, yes for all interventional studies, yes for interventional studies if they have sites in EU, or no, we have not started writing plain language summaries. So this is just to give us a better idea of the folks that are here today and tailor our discussion a bit. Okay, great. So quite a mix here, with the most being no, we have not started. So that's good to know. Okay, great. And I think we have another polling question as well. How do you interpret the EU requirement for a synopsis of the protocol? Two-page protocol synopsis is required in plain language. Protocol synopsis is required. 2 pages and in plain language is optional, or the protocol synopsis itself is optional. If you could take a second and respond, that would be great. Okay, so we have most people thinking 2 pages and in plain language, both requirements. Awesome. And our last one. Did you attend the GLSP workshop on February 14th, 15th, and 16th? And that stands for Good Lay Summary Practice, if folks aren't aware. Okay. 20/80 split, 20 yes, 80 no. Great, thank you very much. Okay, so it sounds like it would be good then to just, briefly go over. I know a lot of folks do know, they are aware of the EU CTR and what goes into it. There's a lot of information included, but this is sort of a nice little overview here. The regulation will ensure greater level of harmonization of the rules for conducting clinical trials throughout the EU. It introduces an authorization procedure based on a single submission via a single EU portal, an assessment procedure leading to a single decision, rules on the protection of subjects and informed consent, and transparency requirements. So it's really sort of this transparency piece where we see the plain language summary and protocol synopsis sort of fitting in the most. And really both of these deliverables have, the potential to make a large impact if done thoughtfully. Go to the next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. So when we go to Annex 1, which Julie mentioned before, it relates to the initial application. Then within Annex 1, go to Section D, which relates to the protocol, and then go to number 24 within that. We see this: the protocol shall be accompanied by a synopsis of the protocol. So, that's not much to go off of, obviously. But then if we go to the next slide, and we look into the question and answer section of the regulation, we see a question 5.8 here, which states what should be included in the protocol synopsis described in Annex 1 D24. So there's been, various versions of this question and answer section. So this is from version 5, which is dated January 2022. So sponsors should include the following information, maximum 2 pages, to be submitted in the clinical trial application according to Annex 1 D24. Sponsors should consider to submit a synopsis that is understandable to the lay person. And they also list 9 elements here to be included in that 2-page document. So EU trial number and full trial title, rationale, so brief background and hypotheses for the trial, objectives, both main and secondary, main trial endpoints and when they were assessed, same were secondary trial endpoints when they were assessed, the trial design, so both describing the design as well as the duration for individual participants that they'll be in the trial. Number 7, the trial population, so major inclusion and exclusion criteria, age, disease, specific disease or condition, or whether there's a healthy volunteer trial, some exclusion criteria that would protect a patient or potential participant. For example, you can't participate if your heart isn't healthy enough. Number 8, interventions. So listing the interventions in the trial as well as their durations and any background treatments that participants might be receiving. And number 9, ethical considerations. So both the expected benefits and risks of both individuals as well as the group, and any foreseen burdens for participants throughout the trial. So some sort of key takeaways or things to note here. I think the 2-page limit is a big one, right? We have a lot of stuff to fit in that 2 pages, especially when we think about secondary trial endpoints. There can be a lot of secondary endpoints for a trial, as well as number 9, ethical considerations that can be very lengthy as well. And to think about writing all of this in plain language, which in general, plain language can be a bit more lengthy as well. So, those are some things that jump out to us as we look at this. If we could go to the next slide, please. So having, thought about this quite a bit and some experience doing it, we have come up with some learnings and some recommendations. So our first one, get creative with formatting. This is our example here of a proposed formatting option that you can use. It helps to break things up into tables and to sort of draw out key elements using color coding and bolded text and sort of other formatting and graphical features like that. Like I said, there's a lot of information to try to fit into 2 pages. So we found that getting creative with formatting and graphics can be really helpful to sort of organizing that information in a way that's meaningful and easy to digest for folks. So another recommendation is to repurpose beyond clinical trial application. So obviously the main purpose of this is to have it for submission to a clinical trial application, but really encourage you to think about other ways to leverage this deliverable as an engagement piece for potential participants. And we can talk a little bit about that more later, but that sort of leads me into our third recommendation here is to consider adding a 3rd page optional glossary. So this 3rd page would include a lot of definitions for key terms, maybe like placebo, double blind, open label, anything that you won't have the space to fully describe in plain language within the actual 2-page requirement for upload to your application, but might be useful for other uses of this document. Work quickly but carefully. So obviously we're trying to meet submission deadlines when we're thinking about this document, but of course we want to be careful and thoughtful about the words that we're choosing and how we're displaying information, especially when we want to think about our fifth point here of potential efficiencies. So we do see potential efficiencies in using the same plain language across multiple public-facing documents. So why reinvent the wheel when you're describing, a certain condition or term in plain language already in a plain language version of a protocol synopsis? You can probably be able to lift that information and use it again and keep that consistency across other patient-facing documents throughout the clinical trial. So really putting in that thought up front at this early stage, we could see having some potential efficiencies there. And so if you could just go to the next slide, please. So Julie alluded to this earlier, but of course, we are talking about the EU regulation, but we did want to flag that it does look like the UK is going to be requesting a similar version of this document for their ISRCTN registry. And it would, of course, be all too easy if you could just use the exact same document for both. But it looks like they have slightly different requirements here. So here's some of them pulled from their website. So describe research to non-expert public, first item listed in public view of a registered study record, and they want this document to be under or around 1,000 words. They also have some requested elements here. Number 1, background and study aims. 2, who can participate. 3, what does the study involve? 4, what are the possible benefits and risks of participating? Number 5, where does the study run from? 6, when is the study starting and how long is it expected to run for? 7, who is funding the study? And finally, 8, who is the main contact? So obviously there is some, overlap between the EU and the UK versions. In the table over here on the right, we've put together a column with the UK elements and then the most similar EU element that you could potentially pull from if you had a trial that was requesting or requiring both documents be created. So the first 3 here are similar enough that you could definitely lift some of the same text, but specific modifications would need to be made to sort of tailor it. The 4th one here, what are the potential risks and benefits? You could essentially pull that, I think, verbatim from the ethical consideration section from the EU version. And the last 4 here are not requested in the EU version, but are requested in the UK version. So those would be new elements to incorporate. So I believe next up is Julie to walk us through our plain language summaries.
Yes, thank you, Kim. And I know we had a question come through the Q&A about whether the slides will be provided afterwards, and that will be in that follow-up communication tomorrow in PDF form. Alongside the recording. So you will be receiving a copy of the slides. Now, as we move on to Annex 5 of the regulation, I think this is the section that most of us are more familiar with, as this has been impending since 2014 as the regulation is dated. But I think it's worth mentioning just the 10 elements here before we discuss a little further on the plain language summaries. So here, of course, we want to include the clinical trial identification. We want to include the sponsor name and the contact details. We want to include general trial info, the where, when, why, and the main objectives. We want to include the participant population. I think the point of contention we see right now is the number included per country, age, sex, and all-inclusive, and split rather, sometimes by inclusion and exclusion criteria, as well as just mentioning the inclusion-exclusion criteria. We want to include the investigational product that was used. We want to describe any adverse reactions and their frequency. We want to report out on the overall results. We want to include some comments on the outcome of the trial. We want to mention the indication, and the indication of follow-up clinical trials will be included as well. And then we want to indicate where they can find additional information. So similar to Annex 1, And the Q&A document kind of bare bones in terms of then how you interpret this. But if we can go to the next slide, I think this is why we've seen so many other supporting documents start to crop up on how to actually produce your plain language summary and really what the best practices are. We're focusing here on the Good Lay Summary Practice Guidance. That's the GLSP. And again, it looks like we were split on who managed to get a spot on that workshop earlier this year. But my colleague Betosh and I both worked on this guidance. And what I've done is included some highlights here for us to go through. So first, from that guidance, we get the direction that patients should, of course, be included in producing the plain language summary and really anything that you're producing for patients. You want to always make sure the target audience's needs are met. And if you don't involve them in the process, then you're not going to be really ensuring that step. So their involvement to us is really a non-negotiable. Second, we discussed at that workshop and in that guidance how ethics committees should be involved. And the upside from that is that ethics committees really have no jurisdiction over the plain language summary. By the time these summaries are produced, in most cases, the trial is over. Databases are locked, patients are not involved in producing or providing, I should say, any additional data. So the plain language summary isn't something the ethics committees need to review. They've been made aware too of the intention to share a plain language summary at the end, and they're posted publicly. So really, the involvement of an ethics committee, unless it's a very special case, they should not be involved in the step. Translations were also discussed, and it was agreed that translations should be provided quickly after the source version is completed, and that's really key for ensuring the broadest access to this document. Then finally, for pediatric versions of the lay summary that can actually help educate the pediatric patients that might have been involved instead of their parents or caregivers, that should be produced as a supplement. That's not something that you should be driving towards for the EU regulation. That's a supplemental document that can come later. So if we can move on to the next slide. CISCRP has a few recommendations to build a successful program for your plain language summaries. First, you want to build a solid program by starting early. Any early learnings, early pilots, when you're not under the constraints of the regulation and its timeline, are of course going to help you think through any potential challenges as you meet them. You also want to be able to create a portfolio-wide template to avoid any inconsistencies or concerns about cherry picking, which is the next bullet point. If you have a consistent template that provides guidance on your endpoints, it's going to be a much less controversial point when you're producing the plain language summary and trying to decide which endpoints to include ad hoc. You also want to start writing the summary as early as possible. And for this, tables, figures, and listings are a very good early point to start when the data is already locked. And we have the final analysis done before we move into the narrative of the CSR. The TFLs really do give you a head start and don't involve too many pauses in the process, like starting even earlier might. And then again, you want to gather feedback from your target audience. This is something you want patients involved in. So if we can transition to the next slide, before we get into our panel discussions today, I wanted to highlight something that we like to call the cycle of patient engagement. And running through all of this is really the need for communication and when we should be communicating, right? So if we think about clinical trial participants, we need to recognize that they go through a lot of different phases in their decision-making and really in their existence in this community. Now, we have members of the public that will eventually come into the point where they're looking for a clinical trial and they become a prospective participant. Then maybe they choose a study, so they become a study participant. And then of course they go through their study experience and become a past participant. But that's not to say that they're not also a member of the public. So that second end of the continuum is a little bit more fluid, but it's important to think about these different points because if we go to the next slide, what it helps us with are understanding the kind of information they need to make decisions, and then how we should be communicating each step of the cycle. And I think the next slide has that laid out, please. So we can take all of this into consideration to help us build the most effective patient engagement and patient-focused and education plan that we can for these programs. And we often see in the clinical trial space that those past participants and members of the public tend to be forgotten when we're talking about engagement and education planning. But the truth is that those participants that were in trials, those members of the public, might transition into prospective patients again. So that's another key thing with plain language communication and setting ourselves up with all of these deliverables, is that if we don't reach them and educate them before a prospective patient enters the part of the cycle where they're choosing a trial, the actual engagement of that patient will be more difficult, and they're not going to be as educated to make their decisions. And I think I saw a few questions come through while I was talking. So the first question, I believe we are working with other consultants who have advised us that 2-page in the plain language synopsis is not a regulation/mandatory, but recommended. And it seems that your take is different. Please explain your thinking. We'll actually get to that in a minute in the panel discussion. That's something I know we'll be covering today. And then we have another question on whether there's a best practice recommendation on timing of the GLS if study has an interim analysis that's used as the basis for the decision. And I believe that's supposed to be the plain language summary, and maybe there was a typo there. So with interim analysis, this was discussed during the GLSP, and that is something that CTIS supports, but is not required. So you want to be doing your plain language summaries really once you have all of your data, so that they don't have to be updated later. And then the question on what a TFL is, that is the abbreviation for what we call your tables, figures, and listings. Really, that's your final stats readout before you begin writing the narrative of the clinical trial results document. So with all of that top of mind, I think we're going to transition into the panel discussion now. And the first thing we wanted to cover is starting at the beginning. You know, who's our target audience for the protocol synopsis, and how can plain language versions benefit them?
Yeah, so I'm curious to give Chris an opportunity to talk. But yeah, I think maybe a good place to start is just going back to that first question about, is this actually a requirement? So yeah, Chris, what's your interpretation?
Well, for me, the main audience is always the non-scientific public, right? In the case of the summary of results, that would include the trial participant, but for the synopsis, we should also think about a potential trial participant, maybe family members or patient advocates, specific organizations that are devoted to a disease areas. These are all, avenues to get patients into trials, and I think that's something that should be thought about when you're developing these. It's a great way to help recruit for your trials.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think it could definitely be a tool, whether it is required or not. You can sort of leverage it to meet a lot of different types of needs.
Right, and I know a lot of the target audience discussion has been, and really the reason we feel it's required is because the target audience is suggested that it's for the IRBs and for their approval of your trials. And it gives them a quicker high-level view of those trials. And sometimes we've heard it as an element that might be useful for primary investigators as well.
Yeah, and really a tool to potentially facilitate discussion between potential participants and site staff as well.
Yeah. Which does open up the next question, which is, what potential benefits do you think offering a protocol synopsis in plain language does provide the readers beyond the scientific community?
Yeah, so for me, that I'm just going to repeat what I said prior to the trial starting. I think it's great for recruitment. I haven't actually spoken to my colleagues in recruitment about using this since it's so new, but I think it would be a great tool for that. And especially in the rare disease area that sometimes there's difficulties in finding the patients. And so having an additional tool to find patients and create some treatments that may not actually exist, I think is a great opportunity.
All right, so we know ideally all trial documents would be translated into plain language. That's of course the best practice for the patient. So Chris, maybe you can talk a little bit about your approach that you've been working on integrating plain language trial documents at UCB.
Sure. So UCB has been creating these summaries since just after the regulation came out in 2014. I don't think any of us expected it to take this long to be implemented, but our initial approach was to develop the plain language summary for all pivotal studies of approved medicines. So we have 6 approved compounds and over 50 summaries on our website today. But today our focus is to create efficiencies wherever possible. So this year, in partnership with CISCRP, we're developing 3 documents in plain language: the informed consent form, the protocol synopsis, and then the plain language summary of the results. And the other thing that we are doing is we are using the protocol synopsis as the basis for the required data fields on the clinical trial information system, the CTIS, that is the new system that will be used for EU CTR. And so this will ensure that as soon as someone clicks on the entry for one of our trials, all the information shown will already be in plain language, and it'll be translated into the languages for the locations that the trial will be running. So we know one of the criticisms of other registries is that they're not patient friendly. I think clinicaltrials.gov is a good example, although they are working on this. But if we can start from the beginning with providing all the information in language that is accessible to the most number of people, and then the protocol is also there. If you're a clinician or a researcher, you can have that scientific version, but this way you provide the information that's accessible from the very beginning. And so that's how we're approaching it. The other thing that we're going to do is what you mentioned earlier, is take the informed consent form and the protocol synopsis and use those as the basis for the summary of results after the trial's end. We have already developed an overview in plain language of what the trial is all about, and that's a requirement for the summary. So that can be the first section of the summary is already written, and therefore we're saving time as we develop them. One of the things I'm really interested in is the creating efficiencies because of the timelines. So if you have a pediatric trial, the timelines are reduced. So instead of 1 year after your trial ends for reporting the results, you only have 6 months. And as many people know, creating a CSR within 6 months can sometimes be challenging, but creating a CSR and a plain language summary that translates that CSR into lay language is doubly challenging. So for pediatric trials, we really need to shorten the timeline. So that's what I'm focused on right now.
And then Kim, maybe you can talk a little bit more from the medical writing perspective about the efficiencies you mentioned earlier with the protocol synopsis and what we've kind of been talking around.
Yeah, so Chris definitely touched on this, and I think is very forward thinking in this way of, yeah, we do have these time constraints. So let's put in the thought sort of as early on as possible in user testing, trying out, figuring out the best way to phrase things in plain language that are actually going to work for the target readership, and hold it consistent across not only all of the documents within a given trial, but you could also hold it consistent across an entire book of work for several trials. So creating those efficiencies are not only beneficial because it saves you time, but it's also being consistent with your target readership and the terms and phrases that they're going to get used to seeing throughout the trial is really helpful.
That's great. And I'm going to jump over to the questions that I've seen come through here because I think that'll fit well with the next question we had planned to discuss. So someone raised a question about translation requirements for the PLS and the protocol synopsis. So for the PLS, that's a required element that they do discuss in the EU regulation. The question there is really when the translations are required to be posted. So the answer is that they're required to be posted as soon as possible. I believe that's verbatim from the regulation after your source document is produced. The best practice is, of course, to translate into every country where you consented a patient so that even patients who may have left the trial and other patients who are interested in the trial can access that information. But you should, in the very least, be producing translations in all of the languages for patients who finished the trial. And for the protocol synopsis, Kim, maybe you can speak a little bit about this.
I haven't read that it's a requirement, but I would think that you would be translating that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, our take on it is that for all the countries that we're applying to run the trial, we will translate into that language. So there will be a protocol. So if we're going to France, Germany, and Spain, we have English, French, German, and Spanish, right? So all the it's the EEA, not just the EU, but everywhere that the EMA covers, all the extended European region and any languages that are within that we plan to run the trial. We'll be doing this synopsis in that language initially, and then, as you said, the plain language summary of results is based upon the informed consent form. So it probably will follow the same trials, but sometimes we add countries and you add sites in new areas, so it may not be 100% the same, but it should follow the informed consent forms.
Yeah. And going back to the requirement for a plain language protocol synopsis, you know, I think given that the target audience is really intended to be your ethics committees, translating it into the languages that the ethics committees are speaking should really be the best practice, right? So in addition to it being available for all the patients and, you know, as Chris is doing in his program, available in every country, it kind of begets the requirement if you're not translating the document into the language the ethics committees are speaking. So I think that brings us up to the last question for discussion that I had planned today. That should give us plenty of time for other questions in the Q&A period. But what obstacles do we see in meeting regulatory requirements or requests for these protocol synopsis and plain language summaries? Chris, do you want to maybe start with that?
Sure. So the main obstacle I see is the timelines that I mentioned earlier, right? The 6 months for pediatric trials. And I will mention that this can catch people out because if you have a participant that is under 18 years old for even 1 day in that trial, EMA considers it a pediatric trial, right? So if your inclusion criteria is 16 and over and you have one 17-year-old, the entire thing has to go through the 6 month time period. So as you mentioned, using the tables, figures, the TFLs to develop the summary, and then comparing that to the final CSR to ensure alignment, it is the practice that we're engaging in, and I think CISCRP recommends that. So that's definitely how we're going to try and address some of those challenges and try and be able to meet the deadlines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for the plain language summary, I think having a template can alleviate a lot of potential problems, and having sort of strict guidelines around a given sponsor's take on the inclusion of secondary endpoints in order to avoid potential bias or cherry picking or anything like that, and sort of sticking firm to those guidelines. And that template can be really helpful to avoid a lot of potential challenges.
Yep. And I think the nuances to the different regulations, right, is also a challenge. So ensuring that we have something that can meet the EU regulations as well as the UK regulations.
Right. Yeah, I think this is another big one, right? This is another issue that came out of Brexit, right? Both the UK and the EU have this requirement for results, and so we can use the same document for both. But the new requirement for the protocol synopsis in the UK, that's the result of the automatic registration on the ISRCTN register by the UK authorities, right? They automatically register your trial, and then you have to follow their requirements. So you highlighted how they're different. So we have to have two versions, right? So that's a challenge, being different in each region. It would be so much easier if they had the same one and you could use the same document for, for all regions.
Yeah. I think I'm seeing a lot of questions come through in the Q&A box, so maybe this is a good time to just transition over into our Q&A period. The first question I see is that, circling back to the previous and important question to clarify, are we stating that the protocol synopsis is required? And the person who's asking the question says that they seek value and have reviewed internally and have concluded it's recommended, not mandated. So can we talk a little bit more about that, Kim?
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear Chris's take and what UCB's take is, but my interpretation when I read that is, yes, you need a protocol synopsis to accompany the protocol. Based on the phrasing in the question and answer latest version, it seems like the 2 pages is required, those 9 elements are required, but that plain language is recommended.
Yeah, and I think we asked this question in the Good Lay Summary Practice workshop to the representative from EMA, but I believe he indicated that it was mandatory. That's my memory, but and so UCB considers this a mandatory document. And
that is my memory as well.
Yeah.
Chris, from that work.
There is some nuance in the written language, so I think that we should ask for clarification so that they can give us some written guidance there. I think they're planning on additional guidances, but that's, we're moving forward with this as a mandatory document based upon that vocalization. But it would be nicer if it was in writing. I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we had another question about how we should handle amendments to the clinical trial protocol when we're producing the clinical trial synopsis. So can you talk a little bit about that, either of you, what that process is like? So
protocol amendments are, happen. And so then you need a new protocol synopsis after each amendment. So that's going to be if you change it, then you need to update your other document. That's how we're approaching it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think that makes sense. I could see maybe if the specific amendment didn't change any of the information that was included in the synopsis, then, you could do without an update maybe, but yeah, definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
Right, but if you change an endpoint or change something along those lines, it would definitely change it, right? So any of your secondary endpoints or requirements. So for me, it seems like in most cases, you would have to update it as well.
Yeah. And then we have 2 questions about the length of the protocol synopsis and really how we're going to meet the 2-page requirement for complex studies. We have one question mentioning a study with 5 to 10 secondary endpoints, and then another question that's asking about PK studies.
It's tough. It's there's no easy answer. Unfortunately, it's tough to fit it in the 2 pages. We're suggesting getting creative with formatting because we find a lot of benefit with sort of a table format where you're formatting the objectives as sort of questions and then the endpoints for how they're going to answer those questions in the study, and sort of, again, highlighting key terms and important definitions in bold, color-coded text. These documents are not as lay-friendly as we would like them to be in order to meet the 2-page requirement. So we're using a smaller font than we would typically recommend, things like that. And that's sort of leading to one of our other recommendations of potentially having an optional 3rd page where you don't necessarily have that be part of your application, but you could still have it as an optional piece that includes sort of a glossary of terms that you wouldn't have the room to sort of spell out for folks within the actual 2 pages. That might be a useful approach.
Yeah. And then we have a question about whether or not the synopsis should include the version details of the protocol. And I think the consensus I've heard so far seems to be that if we're updating it to match the current versions of the protocol and the document is usually date locked, we wouldn't be necessarily referencing directly a version of the protocol because it's always supposed to match the current version of the protocol.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there might be a way to do it though, because if there's lots of changes, like sometimes you have 6 or more, changes to the protocol, then it might make sense to have it noted somewhere that
Agreed.
the synopsis aligns with this protocol. If people download it and save it, and and they may, I can see the value in aligning that in maybe a footer or something.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that question up. That's a very good consideration.
I see someone's asking about involving the patent attorney in the review. I think that's a great idea, and is something that would bring value to it.
Yep, and I think we also have some questions about readability tools. So someone's asking our opinions on using computer-based readability tools on these.
So are there specific examples of?
There is not.
Okay. So I'm assuming they're talking about things like having a clickable document, maybe where you could click on one term and have a window pop up with a definition or something like that. I think you want to be careful and consider what this looks like printed and what the value of it is printed, because while some folks are going to be looking at it on a computer potentially, others will be looking at it as a printed document. So you don't want to make anything that is only understandable if you're viewing it on a computer screen. That would be my initial thought.
Yeah, and I'll add that the Good Lay Summary Practice guidance document includes readability tools in multiple languages, so that might help you know how to what to use to make sure, because the goal is always to make it at a 12-year-old reading level, and sometimes that can be difficult, right? So there are all these readability tools that help ensure that you're at that level.
Yes.
Yes,
gotcha.
that clarification
Readability
just
tools
popped up.
for assessing. Got it. Yeah.
And so there are there's tools for all different languages, and the Good Lay Summary Practice highlights a bunch of them for the EU languages. So I recommend going there for guidance on what to use.
Yeah, and I think this also gets at another question I've seen pop up, and I'm going to kind of roll together into one question here, which is the involvement of patient feedback and really just target audience feedback on these documents. So how would we envision a system for patient feedback to be collected, right? Obviously at CISCRP, we always use a review panel for documents that we're producing, so we can ensure that every single document is developed with patient feedback. And we also have options for developing your templates with patient feedback so that we can have touches at all stages of the process. But is there anything else, Chris or Kim, you can think of that would help get their feedback involved?
Well, I think the way CISCRP does it is very valuable and brings a lot of value to the final project. We do that for our plain language summaries of results. We're updating our template right now, and so I hope to put it through that same process. And for the protocol summaries, I think we should follow a similar process. So I think there's value there. My only concern is about the protocol summaries, the timing, because oftentimes once you get the protocol completed, then you want to submit to start running your trial, but we have to convert it to plain language, and then those plain languages have to be converted into the languages that we're going to apply for. So there's time in all of those elements. So how it and when it's done is something that can be worked out, but I think it definitely brings value to have patients, patient advocates, the public be part of a review team to make sure that the information you're presenting is understandable to them.
Yeah. And then we have a question on basically the use of the protocol synopsis alongside the ICF. So the question is, if the ICF is the quote unquote official document for informing and recruiting patients in a trial, how do we see the protocol synopsis being used alongside? And it's important to hear that CISCRP does not recruit patients, but we focus on educating patients. So before everybody answers, go ahead.
I think that's a great question, and I think they can be used side by side, right? The ICF is going to be a much longer document than the 2 pages, so it's really it should have very similar information, and I can see it being used in similar ways. We don't here at UCB don't have a program to do that yet, but I'm going to talk to my patient recruitment colleagues and let them know these documents are coming, so that if they do want to use them as an abridged 2-page overview, I think that would be appropriate.
Yeah. Kim, do you have anything to add?
No.
I'll always just say that the more education a patient can have, the better. So the more documents that can be put in front of them, that really does benefit the patient, even if you do have a primary recruitment document.
Right. Informed consent forms can be 40, 50 pages in some cases, right? So a 2-page overview is always going to be easier for someone to digest. If it's not right for them, they'll know immediately. If it is right for them, then maybe they want the longer document to get into the weeds, so to speak.
Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I have 2 more questions that have come through in the chat. One is a little specific. So they're asking if we can comment on studies that may have separate arms, or really studies we may think would require separate summaries. And I think the overall comment on that is going to be that it really does depend on the study.
Yeah, I think you're right. Study design in creating these documents can sometimes be a challenge, and we've run into that as we go through our backlog of approved products to create some things. I don't think that the people that design studies think about the plain language part, and I don't think that's really a consideration when they're designing it. Oh, this is going to be hard to translate, but it's something we have to work out afterwards. And working with CISCRP, we've always found solutions for those issues, so I highly recommend them as a partner.
Thank you, Chris.
And then our last question has to do with cherry picking. So can we talk a little bit more about our approaches to avoiding cherry picking in summaries?
Yeah, so I think it's, oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, you go first, because this is a hot topic, and I want to hear what you say first.
Yeah, so I think that's, ultimately up to the sponsor to decide how they're going to approach this. And, we've seen different approaches from different sponsors. Some don't allow any secondary endpoints and only primary endpoints, no exceptions. Some say, okay, well, if it's a patient-reported outcome as a secondary endpoint, then we'll include it as highly relevant to the participant. And some allow for secondary endpoints depending on if they just think it's patient relevant in general. Obviously, that last one is the highest risk of potential cherry picking of endpoints based on the results and only presenting positive results. I think, you know, potentially in an ideal world, teams, if we do want to include secondary endpoints, teams would indicate very early on before collecting any data or anything, you know, yes, we want to include these endpoint results in the summary, no matter what the data says, because we think that they're important for the patient community to hear the results for. But again, you know, ideally that decision would be made very early on in the process.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. From UCB's standpoint, we currently only present primary endpoints, but we're going through a conversation right now to decide if that's how we want to do it going forward. But as Kim said, the guidance is a little bit vague because it mentions participant relevant endpoints of the secondary ones that you should present. And so how do you determine that? I agree it should be done before the data is collected. So that could happen in a couple of different ways. It could happen in the study design or protocol development where you say, okay, these are the ones that are relevant to these patients. And so this will become part of the summary of results. That would be helpful for your stats team so that they can create some tables already when they do their analysis, right? Or you could have a standing list like patient reported outcomes, all primary and all patient reported outcomes. You know, so if there are no patient reported outcomes in your trial, you would only be primary. If there are, then those would be, because those are what patients seem to be asking for. So as long as it's decided either as a blanket rule in your policy or by study when you're developing or designing the study, then I think the danger of cherry picking is greatly reduced. But up until now, we just haven't entertained that, but we are considering it now. And so it's a conversation that's happening, and we're going to define our policy about it soon. So
that's great. Well, we're right at time. So thank you everybody for joining today. If you have not started on your plain language summary programs or want more information on working with us on those programs, please don't hesitate to reach out. All of our contact information is on our website, and we look forward to hearing from you.